Picture this: a single fortress standing against the tide of chaos, its walls guarded not by an army, but by a handful of knights bound by an oath older than the stones beneath their feet. These weren't just warriors, they were the last line of defense for entire kingdoms, the quiet force that kept the world from unraveling. While history books celebrate kings and conquests, the true guardians of the medieval world often operated in the shadows, their names whispered in archives rather than carved into monuments. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 22 of these extraordinary knightly orders, each one a story of courage, cunning, and sacrifice that defies the odds. Think about the moments when civilizations hung by a thread, a plague-ridden city, a mountain pass swarming with invaders, a trade route choked by bandits. In those desperate hours, it wasn't always armies that turned the tide. Sometimes it was a brotherhood of knights, armed with little more than their vows and a stubborn refusal to let the light go out. These orders weren't just fighters, they were diplomats, healers, even engineers, adapting to whatever crisis threatened the people they'd sworn to protect. Their legacy isn't just in battles won, but in the ordinary lives they saved: the villages that didn't burn, the children who grew old, the art and knowledge that survived because they stood in the gap. What makes these knights so fascinating isn't just their heroism, it's how human they were. They weren't mythical figures, they were men who bled, doubted, and sometimes failed, yet still chose to serve something greater than themselves. Over the next 22 stories, you'll meet orders that smuggled refugees through enemy lines, rebuilt bridges to keep trade alive, and even negotiated peace between feuding lords when war seemed inevitable. Some vanished without a trace, their deeds known only to the towns they saved. Others left behind clues: a faded fresco, a crumbling charter, a folk song still sung in remote valleys. This isn't just history, it's a tapestry of resilience, and you're about to see the threads most storytellers miss. So let's begin where all great tales do, not with a crown, but with a choice to stand when others fled. The world of medieval knighthood wasn't just about shining armor and chivalric romances, it was born from necessity, forged in an era when survival itself was a daily struggle. As Europe emerged from the shadow of Rome's fall, two powerful forces shaped these warrior brotherhoods: the relentless violence of feudal warfare and the fiery idealism of the Crusades. Imagine a landscape where local lords battled for scraps of land while distant holy wars drew thousands to distant battlefields. In that crucible, knights began organizing not just as individuals, but as something revolutionary: orders bound by sacred oaths rather than mere feudal obligations. What made these groups extraordinary wasn't just their skill with swords, but their dual nature as both soldiers and monks. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet wielded weapons with deadly precision. The Church called them Militia Christi, soldiers of Christ, and in an age where faith and warfare were deeply intertwined, these orders became a bridge between heaven and earth. While giants like the Templars built vast networks of castles and banks, smaller orders often emerged to solve specific, desperate problems: a mountain pass constantly raided by bandits, a coastal village terrorized by pirates. Somewhere, a handful of knights would take it upon themselves to stand guard, often with no reward but their own sense of purpose. The true genius of these lesser-known orders lay in their adaptability. Unlike kings bound by court politics or popes entangled in doctrine, these knights could act with startling flexibility. In Spain, the Order of Montesa didn't just fight, they rebuilt irrigation systems to revive war-torn farmlands. Along the Baltic coast, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword combined missionary work with fortress building, creating safe havens in pagan territories. And in the Levant, obscure orders like the Knights of St. Lazarus specialized in something even more vital, caring for lepers and plague victims, proving that protection wasn't always about blades and shields. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect was how these orders reflected their environments. In the rugged Pyrenees, knights became mountaineers, learning to navigate treacherous passes to escort pilgrims. In marshy Flanders, they mastered boat combat to patrol flooded battlefields. Their rules, their tactics, even their armor evolved to meet local needs, creating a tapestry of brotherhoods as diverse as the landscapes they guarded. This wasn't one-size-fits-all knighthood, it was a living, breathing response to the crises of their time, written not in proclamations but in deeds. What united them all, from the mightiest Templar to the humblest border patrol, was a singular belief that some walls must not fall, some roads must stay open, some flames, however small, must keep burning. They understood that civilization isn't maintained by grand battles alone, but by countless unheralded acts of stubborn courage. And as we'll see, some of their most remarkable stories didn't happen on famous battlefields, but in the quiet places where history almost turned and didn't. But how do we separate true protectors from the countless armed brotherhoods that dotted medieval Europe? The answer lies in three defining traits that set these 22 orders apart. First, they didn't just exist, they changed the fate of entire regions. Take the Order of Calatrava, born from sheer desperation when a Spanish king abandoned a key fortress. A handful of monks and knights stepped forward, transforming what should have been a bloodbath into a century-long bulwark against Islamic expansion. Their impact wasn't measured in battles alone, but in the farms, monasteries, and trade routes that flourished behind their shield. Second, these orders had to innovate beyond traditional warfare. The Brethren of the Sword, active in the Baltic, didn't just fight pagan tribes, they built a network of fortified monasteries that doubled as economic hubs, turning conflict zones into centers of stability. Meanwhile, the Knights of St. Thomas of Acre, often overshadowed by the Templars, specialized in something far rarer: maritime rescue missions, patrolling the Mediterranean to save shipwrecked pilgrims. Their missions weren't just about swords and sieges, they solved problems kings and armies couldn't, and crucially, their influence outlasted them. The Order of Dobozin, though small and short-lived, left behind something extraordinary: a legal code adopted by neighboring towns, proving that their greatest weapon wasn't steel but ideas. Others, like the Knights of St. Lazarus, survived not through conquest, but by becoming indispensable. Their hospitals became medieval centers of medical knowledge long after their knights laid down their swords. What binds all 22 is their origin in crisis. The Order of the Dragon didn't form in peacetime, it rose as the Ottoman tide threatened to drown Eastern Europe. The Portuguese Order of Aves emerged when coastal villages were vanishing into Viking longships. These weren't vanity projects, they were emergency responses, proving that necessity doesn't just invent, it perfects. Their stories remind us that history's most pivotal moments often hinge not on vast armies, but on the few who refused to let the world collapse quietly. The dragon wasn't just a symbol, it was a warning. When Sigismund of Luxembourg founded the Order of the Dragon in 1408, he wasn't assembling another ceremonial brotherhood. This was an emergency response to the most existential threat Europe had faced in centuries: the relentless advance of the Ottoman Empire. Their emblem, a serpentine dragon wrapped around a cross, wasn't chosen for its majesty but for its meaning. In medieval lore, dragons were both protectors and harbingers of chaos, perfect for an order standing between Christendom and collapse. What set these knights apart wasn't just their military prowess, but their strategic foresight. While other orders focused on holding castles or raiding enemy lines, the dragon's mission was broader, to fortify the very fabric of vulnerable regions. Sigismund handpicked his members from nobility, including Vlad Dracul, father of the infamous Vlad the Impaler, not for their titles but for their influence. These weren't just warriors, they were diplomats tasked with uniting fractious Balkan rulers against a common foe. Their greatest weapon wasn't the sword but the alliance. Consider the timeline they faced. Ottoman forces had already overrun much of the Balkans, their armies inching closer to Hungary's heartland, the Order of the Dragon's real achievement. Buying time, by reinforcing border fortresses and funding local militias, they slowed the Ottoman advance just enough for regions like Wallachia to reorganize defenses. Their campaigns read like a desperate game of chess, sacrificing pawns to protect kings. In one notable stand, a contingent of dragon knights held the iron gates of Transylvania for weeks against overwhelming odds, allowing civilians to flee and armies to regroup. Yet their legacy is tangled in irony. While the order itself faded within decades, its ethos lived on through members like Vlad Dracul, whose son would later become both the terror and savior of Wallachia. The dragon emblem, meant to signify unity against invasion, became entangled with darker legends, proof of how quickly history blurs the line between defender and myth. What makes their story resonate isn't just the battles they fought, but the fragile victories we rarely notice. Every delayed siege, every evacuated village, every month they bought for Europe to catch its breath, these were the moments that reshaped history's trajectory. The Order of the Dragon understood something timeless. Sometimes survival isn't about winning the war, but prolonging the fight until the tide can turn. The fortress of Calatrava should have been lost. That was the grim calculation in 1158 when the Knights Templar, overwhelmed by Almohad forces, made the strategic decision to abandon this critical stronghold in central Spain. With its fall, the path to Toledo, the heart of Christian resistance, lay open, and the Reconquista teetered on the brink. But history has a way of rewriting itself in the hands of the desperate. Into this vacuum stepped an unlikely force, a ragged band of Cistercian monks and local knights, led by a humble abbot named Raimundo de Feitro. Where seasoned warriors saw impossibility, they saw a calling. What followed wasn't just a military stand, it was a revolution in devotion. These men weren't battle-hardened knights, they were scholars, shepherds, and craftsmen who took up swords alongside their rosaries. Their rule borrowed from the Templars, but with a twist: stricter poverty, longer fasts, and a relentless focus on readiness. While other orders built wealth, the Calatravans slept in their armor, believing luxury would dull their edge. Their emblem, a simple crimson cross, became a beacon of defiance against the Almohad tide. The true genius of their defense lay in adaptation. Calatrava wasn't just a fortress, it was a testing ground for new tactics. When siege engines pounded their walls, the knights responded with something unexpected: agricultural sabotage. They poisoned wells along enemy supply routes and burned harvests, not out of cruelty, but to starve besiegers into retreat. When diplomacy worked better than swords, they negotiated secret pacts with local Muslim governors, exploiting fractures within Almohad ranks. This wasn't chivalry as poets imagined it, it was survival, gritty and unromantic. Yet their lasting impact came after the battles. As the order grew, they pioneered a model of fortified charity, turning captured lands into thriving communities. Their commanderies weren't just garrisons, they were hubs of innovation, introducing advanced irrigation to arid regions and funding hospitals that treated Christian and Muslim patients alike. In a stroke of irony, the very order born to resist Islamic rule became a bridge for cultural exchange, preserving Moorish farming techniques that would later revive Spain's economy. The Calatravan's legacy whispers an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes salvation comes not from the mighty, but from those with nothing left to lose. Their story redefines what it means to be a guardian, not just holding ground, but making it flourish against all odds. And perhaps that's why their Crimson Cross still flies over Spanish military units today, a silent tribute to the power of stubborn faith. The fall of the Templars left a gaping hole in Spain's defenses, one that threatened to unravel decades of hard-won progress in the Reconquista. But in the Kingdom of Aragon, where Moorish raids still flickered along the southern borders like embers waiting to catch fire, a solution emerged from an unlikely alliance between a king and a pope. The Order of Montesa wasn't just another knightly brotherhood. It was a carefully crafted experiment, blending the best of the Templars' military legacy with a renewed sense of purpose tailored to Spain's unique challenges. What made Montesa remarkable wasn't its size. It remained modest compared to giants like the Hospitallers, but its surgical precision in addressing Valencia's vulnerabilities. While other orders sprawled across Europe, Montesa's knights focused on a single, volatile frontier, the rugged terrain between Christian-held Valencia and the restless Moorish territories to the south. Their strategy reflected this tight focus. Instead of grand castles, they built watchtowers along smuggling routes. Rather than massed cavalry charges, they perfected guerrilla-style ambushes, using the landscape itself as a weapon. One contemporary chronicle describes them as ghosts in the mountains, striking at night and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Yet their true innovation lay in how they sustained their mission. Unlike the Templars, who relied on international banking, Montesa rooted itself in local ecosystems. They negotiated agreements with Valencian farmers, protecting harvests in exchange for a share of crops, a system that turned peasants into lookouts and granaries into early warning systems. Their commanderies doubled as agricultural schools, introducing drought-resistant crops to stabilize the region's food supply. This wasn't just defense, it was nation-building through pragmatism. The Order's adaptability shone brightest during the War of the Two Peters in the 1360s, when rival Christian kingdoms turned on each other, leaving Valencia exposed. Montesa's knights pivoted seamlessly from fighting Moors to brokering ceasefires between Aragonese and Castilian lords. Their reputation for impartiality, bolstered by their strict vow to avoid feudal politics, made them trusted mediators in a land tearing itself apart. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the best way to guard a border isn't with swords, but with wisdom. Montesa's legacy lingers in the quiet details. The irrigation canals still used in Valencia's orange groves, the medieval land deeds bearing their distinctive cross and lily emblem, even the local slang word Montesino, meaning someone who stands firm against impossible odds. They proved that a knightly order's impact isn't measured in battles alone, but in the ordinary lives it enables to flourish. And perhaps that's the lesson etched into their forgotten story, that the greatest defenses are those that don't just repel invaders, but make a land worth defending. While the great crusading orders marched eastward to reclaim holy sites, a quieter but no less critical battle unfolded along the muddy roads of northern Italy. The Order of the Blessed Virgin Mary, known to locals as the Frata's Militia-Marie, didn't fight Saracens or pagans. Their war was against enemies closer to home. In the Romagna region, where bandit lords and heretical sects choked the lifeblood of commerce, these knights became something unprecedented. peacekeepers in armor, turning their swords not toward distant holy lands, but to the immediate survival of their own communities. What set them apart wasn't just their mission, but their methods. While Templars amassed wealth and Teutonic knights conquered territories, the Frata's Militia-Marie operated like a medieval police force. Their patrols along the Via Emilia, Rome's ancient artery of trade, weren't grand campaigns but daily acts of vigilance. Merchants knew them by sight, their distinctive white mantles bearing a blue star symbolizing Mary's protection. Unlike other orders that answered to popes or kings, these knights reported to town councils, their priorities shaped by the practical needs of butchers, bakers, and silk traders. Their tactics reflected this grassroots focus. When bandits hid in the Apennine foothills, the knights didn't storm their lairs, they set up toll stations to fund road repairs, eliminating ambush points. Faced with heretical preachers swaying the poor, they established hostels where travelers could find food and orthodox sermons instead of radical ideas. One surviving ledger from Bologna details how they even mediated disputes between rival guilds, preventing trade wars that could have crippled regional economies. This wasn't just law enforcement, it was social engineering through chivalry. The order's decline holds a poignant lesson. As papal power grew in the 14th century, Rome pressured them to abandon their local mission for grander crusades. Stripped from the work they'd mastered, the knights faded into obscurity. Yet their legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern Italian traffic police still use the term Fratelli della Strada, brothers of the road, a phrase first coined for these forgotten guardians. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest battles aren't for glory or territory, but for the right of ordinary people to travel safely to market. The Order of the Star didn't rise from battlefield glory. It was born in a moment of national humiliation. By 1351, France lay reeling from crushing defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, its knights mocked across Europe for fleeing English longbowmen. King John II's solution wasn't more soldiers or better armor, but something far more radical. A brotherhood built not on conquest, but on an unbreakable code of honor. Their emblem, a glittering star, symbolized their guiding principle, that true knighthood meant standing your ground, even when death seemed certain. This wasn't just symbolism. The order's rules included a chilling vow. Members swore never to retreat more than 4 paces in battle unless outnumbered 3-1 or facing certain death. On paper, it reads like folly. In practice, it reshaped France's military culture. Where other orders measured success in lands won or treasures seized, the Star's knights kept score in acts of defiant courage. Chronicles tell of members deliberately dismounting to fight on foot against cavalry charges, or holding bridges with handfuls of men to buy time for retreating armies. Their most famous stand came at Moron in 1352, where 36 knights stood encircled, refusing surrender until only 9 remained alive, a sacrifice that slowed the English advance long enough for French reinforcements to regroup. Yet their real impact wasn't on battlefields, but in the fractured halls of French nobility. The 100 Years' War had exposed a bitter truth. France's knights often fought each other as fiercely as they fought the English. The Order of the Star became a diplomatic tool, binding rival lords through shared oaths. Membership required proof of noble lineage, but also something rarer, a spotless reputation. Blacksmiths' sons couldn't join, but neither could corrupt barons. In an age where loyalty was for sale, these knights answered only to their conscience and their king. What makes their story so compelling is how their ideals outlasted them. Though the order faded after John II's capture at Poitiers, their ethos seeped into French military doctrine. Future commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin, architect of France's eventual victory, would cite the star's example when rallying troops. Even their apparent failures held lessons. That suicidal vow against retreat, modern historians argue it wasn't about blind bravery, but about restoring something medieval armies had lost: the discipline to hold formation. In the end, the Order of the Star proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword, but a standard to rally around, one bright enough to guide a nation through its darkest night. The sash of the Order of the Band wasn't just fabric, it was a revolution stitched in silk. When King Alfonso XI of Castile founded this brotherhood in 1330, his kingdom was fracturing at the seams. Noble families warred over scraps of land while Moorish raids exploited the chaos. What Castile needed wasn't more knights, but knights who would act as one. The solution: a simple yet profound emblem, a band of cloth worn diagonally across the chest, binding each member not just to their king, but to each other in a way feudal oaths never could. This was more than symbolism, it was social engineering. Unlike other orders that prized individual heroics, the band's rules demanded collective responsibility. If one knight broke ranks in battle, the entire order shared his disgrace. Their initiation rituals reinforced this mindset. New members received their sashes not from the king, but from fellow knights, a deliberate act that placed peer loyalty above royal favor. Contemporary accounts describe how band knights developed their own battle dialect, coded whistles and hand signals to coordinate without words, turning scattered warriors into something resembling a single organism. Their greatest test came during the siege of Algeciras in 1342. As Castilian forces wavered against Granada's defenders, the band's knights formed a living bridge across a breached wall, locking shields in a human chain that held for hours. What made their stand remarkable wasn't just their endurance, but their composition. Records show they included rival noblemen whose families had feuded for generations. Under that sash, old grudges melted away. The siege marked a turning point, proving that unity could outmuscle even the fiercest enemies. Beyond battlefields, the order reshaped Castilian society. Their chapter houses became neutral grounds where disputing nobles could negotiate under the band's banner. Their courts of the sash settled land disputes with judgments so fair that peasants began appealing to them over local lords. Even their fashion choice sparked change soon. Merchants and artisans adopted similar sashes as symbols of trustworthiness, creating an unexpected cultural ripple. The band's legacy lies in its quiet radicalism. In an age when knights were expected to chase personal glory, they championed something far more powerful: the idea that true strength comes from interdependence. Their sash, now preserved in Toledo's armory, whispers a lesson we've relearned through centuries: that when threads weave together, they can hold back the weight of the world. The coastline of 14th century Naples was a battleground without borders, where pirate galleys materialized like storms and vanished before armies could respond. Into this chaos sailed an order so specialized that history nearly forgot them: the Knights of the Ship and the Double Crescent. Their emblem, a vessel framed by twin moons, wasn't just decoration, it was a declaration. These men weren't just warriors on water, they were hybrid defenders, mastering the liminal space where land and sea blurred into war. What set them apart wasn't just their skill with sails, but their understanding of pirates as more than raiders. They were economic saboteurs. A single successful attack could strangle a port's trade for months, triggering food shortages and bankruptcies. The Order's solution: a network of fortified lighthouses doubling as early warning towers, their signal fires visible for miles. When pirates struck, these beacons didn't just alert towns, they triggered a meticulously rehearsed response. Fishing boats transformed into scout vessels, while farmers pre-positioned hay bales to create makeshift barriers on beaches. This wasn't just defense, it was community-wide warfare. Their tactics read like a medieval playbook for asymmetric combat. Instead of engaging pirates at sea where their lighter ships often outmaneuvered Neapolitan galleys, the knights lured raiders into shallow coves rigged with submerged chains and spike-lined nets. Once trapped, land-based archers rained fire from cliffs while knights waded into the surf in modified armor, their greaves lined with cork to prevent sinking. Contemporary accounts describe how they even used fire ships disguised as merchant vessels, exploding enemy fleets with barrels of Greek fire, a terrifying precursor to naval mines. Yet their true legacy lies in how they reshaped Naples' destiny. By securing the Amalfi Coast's trade routes, the order enabled artists like Boccaccio to flourish in relative peace, their protection extending beyond goods to the flow of ideas. Later records suggest their innovations influenced maritime republics like Venice, where similar hybrid defenses appeared against Ottoman raids. Even their decline holds a lesson. When the order disbanded in the 15th century, pirate attacks surged, proving how quietly essential their work had been. The Knights of the Double Crescent understood something timeless. That safety isn't just about repelling attacks, but about making the cost of aggression too high to bear. Their story lingers in the weathered watchtowers still dotting Italy's coast, silent witnesses to an order that didn't just defend shores, but defined them. René of Anjou didn't just need knights, he needed statesmen in armor. When he founded the Order of the Crescent in 1448, the threat wasn't just Burgundian steel, but their growing web of alliances that stretched from Flanders to the Alps. His solution, a brotherhood that could wield parchment as deftly as swords, turning Provos's vulnerable position into a diplomatic chessboard. Their emblem, a golden crescent cradling a sword, wasn't just heraldry, it was a mission statement, power tempered by wisdom. What set these knights apart was their dual training. While other orders drilled endlessly in combat, the Crescents initiate studied law, languages, and even poetry. Records from their archives reveal a curriculum that included Moorish trade agreements, Italian banking practices, and the art of composing flattering verses to potential allies. This wasn't decadence, it was strategy. When Burgundy's Duke Philip the Good sent envoys to sway Provençal towns, Crescent Knights countered with economic incentives, brokering deals for tax exemptions that kept merchants loyal. One surviving letter shows how they even intervened in a wool trade dispute between Arles and Avignon, turning a potential revolt into a revenue stream for the crown. Their battlefield tactics mirrored this flexibility. Instead of mass charges, they specialized in shadow campaigns, staging nighttime torch processions through mountain passes to mimic larger forces, or bribing Burgundian mercenaries to lose supply wagons. During the Siege of Marseille in 1453, they turned the city's famed soap makers into unlikely allies, using olive oil stores to create fire barriers that repelled attackers. But their masterstroke came through marriage diplomacy. By strategically arranging unions between Angevin loyalists and Burgundian vassals, they slowly unraveled Philip's network, one wedding at a time. The Order's decline holds an ironic twist. As France consolidated power, their nuanced approach became obsolete. Kings wanted soldiers, not poet warriors. Yet their legacy lived on in unexpected ways. The first French Foreign Service Academy borrowed their training manuals, and their crest's crescent motif resurfaced centuries later in Napoleon's Egyptian campaign decorations. Perhaps their greatest lesson was that the strongest walls aren't always made of stone. Sometimes they're woven from alliances, economics, and the occasional perfectly timed sonnet. The Thistle wasn't just Scotland's floral emblem. It was a battle cry woven into the very fabric of a knightly order born from defiance. When James VII re-established the Order of the Thistle in 1687, he wasn't reviving some ceremonial relic. This was a calculated move to mend a fractured kingdom, using ancient symbols to unite clans who'd spent centuries at each other's throats. Their motto, "Nemo me impune lacessit," no one attacks me with impunity, wasn't mere poetry. It was a warning to England and a promise to Highlanders. Scotland's identity would not be erased. What made the Thistle unique wasn't just its martial role, but its dual existence as both shield and sanctuary. While other orders built castles, these knights fortified culture. During the brutal suppression of Highland traditions following the Jacobite rebellions, Thistle members smuggled Gaelic manuscripts in hollowed-out claymores and hosted clandestine ceilidhs under the guise of hunting parties. One surviving account describes how they disguised bardic poetry as livestock ledgers, preserving verses that would later fuel Scotland's literary revival. Their grand chapel at St. Giles Cathedral became a covert archive, its stained glass windows hiding compartments for forbidden tartan patterns and clan genealogies. Military historians often overlook their tactical innovations. Unlike traditional knights who relied on heavy cavalry, the Thistle's members adapted guerrilla tactics from Highland warfare. They pioneered what modern strategists would call asymmetric defense, using Scotland's harsh terrain as an ally. During William of Orange's campaigns, Thistle knights orchestrated ghost musters, moving between glens to create the illusion of larger forces. Their most daring operation involved bribing English quartermasters to mislabel supply routes, leading hostile troops into bogs and ambushes. Yet their true legacy lies in the delicate balance they struck between resistance and diplomacy. While fiercely patriotic, the order also served as back-channel negotiators during the Act of Union debates. Several Thistle knights secretly brokered compromises that preserved Scottish legal and educational systems, small victories that kept the nation's identity intact even as political sovereignty faded. Today, their green robes and golden insignia might seem like quaint tradition, but each thread carries the weight of a people who refused to disappear. The Thistle's prickles weren't just for show, they were nature's reminder that some things demand to be handled with care, or not at all. The Ermine's white winter coat wasn't chosen as a mere heraldic flourish, it was a statement of survival. When Duke John IV of Brittany founded the Order of the Ermine in 1381, his duchy was caught in a deadly squeeze between England's ambitions and France's hunger for consolidation. That small, fierce animal, known for preferring death to soiling its pristine fur, became the perfect emblem for a people determined to preserve their identity at any cost. This wasn't just another knightly brotherhood, it was a cultural fortress disguised as a chivalric order. What set the Ermine apart was its mastery of soft power long before the term existed. While other orders focused on battlefield glory, these knights waged their struggle in banquet halls and marriage contracts. Membership required proof of Breton lineage, binding the region's fractious nobility through shared blood rather than feudal obligation. Their ceremonies deliberately incorporated ancient Breton legends, weaving Arthurian motifs into Catholic rites to create a distinct spiritual identity. One surviving manuscript describes initiates swearing oaths not just to the Duke, but to the land and language of Brittany, a radical notion in an era when loyalty was supposed to flow upward to kings, not sideways to cultures. Their military tactics mirrored this unconventional approach. Facing superior French forces, the order pioneered what modern strategists would call resilience warfare. Instead of pitched battles, they orchestrated targeted strikes against supply lines, using intimate knowledge of Brittany's labyrinthine coastlines to stage devastating ambushes. During the siege of Hennebont in 1394, Ermine knights disguised fishing boats as merchant vessels, luring French troops into tidal traps where the advancing sea became their deadliest ally. Yet their most enduring victory came through diplomacy. The Order's members became master negotiators, playing England and France against each other with calculated precision. By guaranteeing Breton neutrality during the 100 Years' War's bloodiest phases, they transformed their homeland into a haven for refugees and merchants alike, a pivot that revitalized the regional economy. Their crowning achievement, the Treaty of Guérande in 1365, which preserved Breton autonomy for another century through a delicate balance of feigned allegiance and quiet defiance. The Ermine's legacy lingers not in crumbling castles, but in living traditions. Today, Breton folk songs still reference the Order's motto, Potius mori quam fodari, rather death than dishonor, while their emblem graces everything from regional flags to modern cultural revival movements. They proved that sovereignty isn't just won with swords, but through the stubborn cultivation of identity, one carefully guarded symbol, one strategic marriage, one whispered folktale at a time. High in the alpine snowfields where even the wind seemed to hesitate, the Order of the Collar turned vertical drops into weapons and blizzards into allies. Founded in 1362 by Count Amadeus VI of Savoy, this brotherhood didn't just guard mountain passes, they mastered them with an intimacy that bordered on the supernatural. While other knights trained on open plains, the Collar's initiates learned to read avalanches before they cracked loose, to spot disturbed scree that signaled ambushes, and to navigate whiteout storms by the scent of pine resin carried on freezing air. Their emblem, a simple golden collar, wasn't just decoration. It was a badge of trust worn by men who could literally save your life by knowing which hidden ledge would hold your weight. The secret to their dominance lay in redefining what defense meant in vertical terrain. Instead of building costly fortresses, they transformed natural features into strategic assets. A narrow pass near Montesa became their masterpiece. By subtly altering rock formations over years, they created choke points invisible to outsiders but deadly effective. Merchants traveling with collar knights would watch in awe as their escorts triggered controlled rockfalls to block pursuing bandits, or led them through caverns where torches were unnecessary. The knights had memorized every echo and draft. Their greatest tactical innovation, the shepherd's gambit, where they deliberately let small raiding parties through alpine bottlenecks only to trap them against false dead ends, turning the mountains themselves into prison walls. What truly set them apart was their economic foresight. Understanding that safe passage meant nothing if traders starved, they established a network of way stations stocked with provisions purchased through a clever tariff system. For a small percentage of cargo value, merchants received not just protection but guaranteed supplies, veterinary care for pack animals, and even insurance against avalanches, an early medieval version of risk management. Records from Chambéry's archives show how they negotiated with local cheesemakers to provision these stops, creating a thriving trade that stabilized remote communities. The Order didn't just defend Savoy's borders, they wove its fractured valleys into a cohesive economic unit through sheer logistical brilliance. Their decline holds a poignant lesson in adaptability. When gunpowder rendered high-altitude ambushes less effective, the Order pivoted to become alpine guides and road engineers, their knowledge preserving lives long after their swords rusted. Today, modern mountain rescue teams in the Savoy region still use pathfinding techniques first mapped by these knights, proof that the most enduring defenses aren't walls or weapons, but knowledge passed down through generations of those who refuse to let the wilderness win. The golden towers of Lisbon's skyline weren't just symbols of wealth, they were targets. By the mid-15th century, Portugal's bustling capital had become a magnet for North African corsairs, its docks teeming with spices, gold, and navigational secrets too precious to lose. Into this crisis stepped the Order of the Tower and Sword, founded by King Afonso V in 1459 with a singular mission: to turn the Tagus River into a fortress without walls. Their emblem, a sword piercing a tower, wasn't just heraldry, it was a promise etched in steel and stone. What set these knights apart wasn't just their combat prowess, but their revolutionary approach to maritime defense. While other orders patrolled land borders, the Tower and Swords Knights became masters of tidal warfare. They studied the Tagus's currents like monks poring over sacred texts, learning where hidden sandbars could trap enemy ships at low tide. Their watchtowers doubled as early warning systems, with signal fires calibrated to differentiate between harmless fishermen and corsair sails. One surviving logbook details how they choreographed false harbor traffic, decoy ships with lanterns mimicking merchant convoys, to lure raiders into ambushes where the river itself became their accomplice. Their true genius lay in synergy with Portugal's explorers. While Prince Henry's navigators charted new worlds, these knights ensured Lisbon remained the unshakable anchor of those ambitions. By neutralizing corsair threats, they transformed Portugal's ports into sanctuaries where shipwrights could perfect caravel designs without fear of sabotage. Historians often credit their vigilance for Vasco da Gama's successful departures, no small feat when a single burned dock could delay history by years. Beyond brute force, the Order wielded economic leverage. They established a network of informants from Algiers to Madeira, bribing corsair crews to betray attack plans or strand their captains. Their silver shield strategy, paying ransom for captured sailors before prices inflated, kept Portugal's nautical expertise from rotting in foreign dungeons. Even their failures taught vital lessons. After a rare successful raid in 1472 exposed weak spots, they pioneered modular dock designs where burning sections could be isolated like fire breaks. The Tower and Swords legacy hides in plain sight today. The very towers that gave them their name still stand along Lisbon's waterfront, their original function forgotten by most. Yet every time a cruise ship glides safely into harbor or a cargo vessel unloads without incident, their echo lingers, proof that the greatest explorers need sentinels at their backs, watching the horizon so others can sail beyond it. The mountains didn't care about kings or caliphs, they only obeyed those who learned their language. That harsh truth defined the Order of the Lily, a brotherhood forged in the Pyrenees' knife-edged valleys where a single blocked pass could starve kingdoms. Founded in 1184 by Sancho VI of Navarre, their emblem, a silver lily on azure, wasn't just a symbol of purity, but a coded map. The flower's 3 petals represented the 3 critical trade routes they kept open: the Roncesvalles pass to France, the Jocka road to Aragon, and the secret goat tracks linking Christian and Muslim villages that official maps pretended didn't exist. What made these knights extraordinary wasn't their numbers, rarely more than 50 at any time, but their mastery of what modern strategists would call threshold warfare. They understood that in mountain conflicts, control wasn't about holding ground, but controlling flow. Instead of garrisoning every trail, they maintained a handful of fortified mills where grain could be ground only with their permission. This created invisible leverage. Warring lords might ignore borders, but hungry peasants would pressure them to negotiate. Their archives in Pamplona still preserve records of bread truces, local ceasefires brokered so harvests could reach these mills safely. Their true weapon, however, was cultural fluency. While other orders saw Muslim neighbors as enemies, the Lily's Knights employed Moorish engineers to maintain irrigation channels that fed border villages on both sides. They kept a rotating council of translators fluent in Basque, Arabic, and Occitan, allowing them to intercept disputes before they escalated. One remarkable incident in 1221 saw them defuse a brewing war by revealing that a desecrated Christian shrine was actually damaged by a bear, a fact their trackers confirmed by studying claw marks and scat, sparing countless lives over a misunderstanding. The Order's decline offers a quiet lesson in obsolescence. As Navarre's borders stabilized, their hybrid role became unnecessary. Yet their legacy lingers in the Pyrenees' enduring spirit of exchange. The same mountain valleys that once required knights to keep open now host hikers following ancient trails first secured by men who knew that sometimes the strongest defense is a bridge, not a wall. The Golden Fleece wasn't just a mythical prize, it was a lifeline woven into the very fabric of Flanders' survival. When Duke Philip the Good founded this legendary order in 1430, Burgundy stood at a crossroads. The 100 Years' War had turned neighboring France into a battleground, and Flanders' thriving wool trade, the economic heartbeat of Northern Europe, teetered on collapse. What began as a chivalric vanity project quickly revealed its true purpose, to be the invisible hand guiding merchants through war zones, their golden emblem a universal guarantee of safe passage in an era where trust was rarer than gold. Unlike other knightly brotherhoods obsessed with martial glory, the Fleece's early members were as likely to carry ledgers as lances. Their initiation rituals included not just sword oaths, but examinations of trade law and currency exchange rates. Surviving account books from Bruges show how they operated like a medieval IMF, issuing letters of credit that could be honored across warring territories, a system so reliable that Italian bankers preferred their seals to royal decrees. When English wool shipments stalled due to naval blockades, Fleece knights brokered an audacious overland detour through neutral territories, using their diplomatic immunity to escort convoys past rival armies. Their true innovation lay in economic warfare. Recognizing that Flanders' survival depended on stable prices, they established a secret network of grain warehouses along the Scheldt River. By releasing strategic reserves during shortages, they prevented the bread riots that toppled other regions. One remarkable incident in 1442 saw them flood the market with Baltic rye purchased months earlier, undercutting speculators who'd hoarded local wheat. Contemporary chronicles describe how their agents even disguised themselves as monks to distribute subsidized wool to weavers' guilds, ensuring looms kept humming through the worst winters. Yet the Order's most enduring legacy was its role as a neutral arbiter. When disputes between Hanseatic merchants and Flemish drapers threatened to escalate into trade wars, Fleece knights presided over wool courts, where cases were decided by commercial precedent rather than feudal favoritism. Their rulings, preserved in Ghent's archives, read like early antitrust legislation, punishing price fixing and monopolies with fines paid not in coin, but in charitable donations to leper colonies. The Golden Fleece's brilliance lay in understanding that true power wasn't just about controlling land, but controlling the flow of wealth across it. Their story transforms our image of medieval knights from sword-swinging warriors to economic architects, men who knew that sometimes the surest way to save a kingdom was to keep its merchants in business. That golden ram hanging from their chains, it wasn't just decoration. It was a reminder that civilization itself depends on the fragile threads of trust between those who make, those who move, and those who guard the things we all rely on. The waves off Catalonia's coast carried both salt and terror in the early 13th century. Each dawn might bring pirate sails slicing through the mist toward undefended villages. Into this relentless uncertainty stepped the Order of Saint George of Alfama, founded in 1201 not by a king's decree, but by the collective desperation of coastal communities. Their emblem, a crimson dragon slithering beneath a cross, was no idle decoration. It symbolized their dual mission, to be both serpent and shield, striking invaders while coiling protectively around the fragile livelihoods clinging to the shoreline. While Templars built castles and hospitallers tended pilgrims, these Catalan knights mastered something far more fluid, the art of fighting on water's ever-shifting battlefield. Their galleys weren't the hulking warships of later eras, but agile louts, shallow-drafted vessels that could pivot from chasing pirates to rescuing fishermen in a heartbeat. Naval records from Barcelona's archives reveal their ingenious tactics, disguising their ships as merchant vessels with removable masthead banners, or using fishing nets weighted with hooks to tangle enemy oars mid-pursuit. One particularly bold maneuver involved herding pirate ships toward known whirlpools off the Ebro Delta, letting the sea itself deliver justice. What truly set them apart was their symbiotic relationship with the coastline's rhythm. Unlike landlocked orders that saw the sea as a barrier, Saint George's knights studied its moods like scholars parsing scripture. They timed patrols to the spawning seasons of bluefin tuna, when fishing fleets were most vulnerable, and established signal towers that used reflected sunlight by day and coded bonfires by night. Their greatest innovation, a rotating duty system where each knight spent one winter month living with coastal families, not as overlords but as working crew on fishing boats. This intimacy with local needs led to life-saving adaptations, like equipping their galleys with reserve holds for emergency grain shipments when raids disrupted harvests. The order's influence rippled far beyond Catalonia. Their naval manuals, copied secretly by Venetian admirals, introduced concepts like staggered watch rotations and storm evasion charts. Later maritime orders from Malta to the Baltic adopted their practice of keeping a vow ship, a designated vessel crewed entirely by knights who'd sworn poverty, ensuring no financial disputes could compromise readiness. Even their decline held lessons. When merged with Montesa in 1400, their coastal watch systems lived on in Spain's guardacostas, proving that the best defenses aren't just built, they're woven into the daily fabric of survival. Saint George's legacy lingers not in ruined forts, but in the quiet confidence of Catalan fishing villages where children still learn to spot troubled waters, and the distant, glinting promise of protection. The frozen marshes of the Baltic were no place for half measures. When Bishop Albert of Riga founded the Order of the Sword Brethren in 1202, he wasn't sending knights to a holy war, he was dispatching survivalists to a land that fought back with blizzards, wolves, and tribes who'd resisted conversion for centuries. Their emblem, a red sword crossed with a white star, wasn't just a badge. It was a warning etched in steel and snow. These men didn't just battle pagans, they waged war against entropy itself, propping up Christian settlements so fragile that a single bad harvest could erase them from history. What made the Sword Brethren extraordinary wasn't their brutality, though chronicles detail enough of that, but their logistical ingenuity. In a region with no roads, they built fortified granaries at river junctions, controlling food supplies to stabilize volatile frontiers. When pagan Livonians burned crops to starve out settlers, the knights responded with floating storehouses, barges that could relocate provisions overnight. Their most infamous stronghold, Wendon Castle, wasn't just a military base. It was a carefully calculated node in a network of shelters spaced precisely one winter day's march apart. A settler caught in a blizzard knew survival meant reaching the next cross-marked outpost before dusk. Their methods read like a manual for frontier psychology. Recognizing that local tribes valued oaths above all, the knights developed a chilling ritual. Surrendering chieftains were forced to swallow fragments of their own shattered weapons, binding them to treaties with the metallic taste of defeat. Yet they also adapted indigenous tactics, adopting the Livonian practice of winter warfare, using frozen rivers as highways for surprise attacks. One campaign report describes how they marched entire armies across the Gulf of Riga's ice, something no European force had dared attempt. Controversy clings to their legacy like Baltic fog. While they protected German merchants and missionaries, their relentless demand for tithes often bled converts drier than any pagan raid. When the order fell to pagan forces at the Battle of Saul in 1236, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was the collapse of a system too rigid for the land it tried to tame. Yet their absorption into the Teutonic Knights proved their lasting impact. Their hard-won knowledge of Baltic terrain and tribal politics became the foundation for centuries of Crusader campaigns. The Sword Brethren's true monument isn't in crumbling castles, but in the very existence of Latvia's oldest churches, structures that stand today because these men understood that defending civilization sometimes meant becoming as relentless as the wilderness they fought. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre wasn't just a pilgrimage site, it was a beating heart in a land where faith and survival were inseparable. While most remember the Order of the Holy Sepulchre for their religious duties, their lesser-known military wing became the quiet architects of stability in the Levant's chaos. Founded in the wake of the First Crusade's bloody euphoria, these knights faced a paradox: how to protect the vulnerable without becoming just another faction adding to the violence. Their solution, a delicate balance of armed escorts and diplomacy that turned pilgrim roads into lifelines for entire economies. Unlike the Templars who patrolled with visible menace, the Holy Sepulchre's knights mastered the art of subtle presence. Their white mantles bore a distinctive red cross with 5 smaller crosses symbolizing Christ's wounds, but also serving as a coded message to travelers: this route is watched. Merchant caravans paid no formal tolls, but donations to the order ensured their scouts would signal approaching bandits or Mamluk patrols. Records from Acre's archives detail how they maintained safe zones around key wells and mountain passes, not by garrisoning them, but by negotiating complex agreements with local Bedouin tribes. One remarkable treaty from 1193 even allowed rival Muslim and Christian merchants to share watering holes under the knights' supervision, an early lesson in conflict economics. Their true innovation lay in logistics, not warfare. While other orders hoarded relics, the Holy Sepulchre collected something far more valuable: weather patterns. Their monks-turned-cartographers documented seasonal wind shifts in the Judean desert, allowing pilgrim groups to avoid deadly summer siroccos. They pioneered the use of way stations with multilingual translators, often Jewish or Samaritan converts, who could mediate disputes before they turned violent. When Saladin's forces closed in on Jerusalem in 1187, it was these knights who organized the evacuation of over 3,000 non-combatants through secret cistern tunnels, then negotiated their safe passage to Tyre in exchange for medical aid to wounded Saracen soldiers. The order's legacy hides in plain sight today. Modern archaeologists tracing the old pilgrim routes keep stumbling upon their subtle markers: a cross chiseled into a cliff face here, a strategically placed cistern there, evidence of a protection system designed to endure beyond the Crusades' collapse. Their greatest lesson wasn't in swordplay, but in understanding that true safety isn't imposed by force, but woven through countless small acts of foresight and fairness. When the last Crusader stronghold fell, it was their network of interfaith contacts that allowed some knights to remain in the Levant as trusted physicians and interpreters, proof that even in defeat, their vision of coexistence couldn't be erased. The gates of Jerusalem had seen countless defenders, but none like the Knights of St. Lazarus. Their white mantles, emblazoned with a green 8-pointed cross, hid wounds far deeper than sword cuts. These were warriors battling both Saracens and their own ravaged bodies. What began as a humble leper hospice near the city walls transformed into one of history's most extraordinary fighting forces, an order where the terminally ill became the last line between salvation and slaughter. Leprosy in the medieval mind wasn't just a disease, it was divine punishment, a living death that exiled sufferers beyond city walls. Yet the Lazarus Knights weaponized their outcast status. When Saladin's armies surrounded Jerusalem in 1187, conventional defenders faltered at the sight of his siege towers, but the leper knights, their faces masked by hoods to hide disfigurement, stood firm. Chroniclers describe how their very appearance terrified enemy soldiers, who believed fighting the walking dead brought curses. The knights' greatest tactical advantage wasn't strength or numbers, but the sheer psychological terror of men with nothing left to lose. Their combat methods defied all convention. Unable to grip swords tightly as their fingers decayed, they adapted by welding handguards directly to their weapons. Some wrapped their arms in linen soaked in pitch when blades failed. They'd ignite these bandages to grapple enemies in burning embraces. Most chillingly, they exploited the medieval fear of contagion by deliberately removing hoods during charges, causing superstitious foes to break formation. A Mongol chronicle later mistook them for demon warriors whose breath could kill, a myth the order quietly encouraged, yet their legacy extends beyond battlefield horrors. The Lazarus Knights established Jerusalem's first quarantine protocols, using their understanding of disease to isolate plague victims. Their hospice became a rare place where Muslim and Christian doctors exchanged medical knowledge, with Arabic texts on wound care translated by their scribes. When the city finally fell, Saladin himself granted them safe passage not out of mercy, but respect for warriors who defended the sick even as they themselves rotted. Modern medicine might dismiss their tactics as barbaric, but their ethos echoes in today's battlefield medics and hospice caregivers. The green cross they wore now symbolizes pharmaceutical aid worldwide, an ironic tribute to men who turned affliction into armor. Their story challenges us to reconsider what true strength looks like, not the perfection of the body, but the indomitable will to stand between darkness and those who still have time. The white dove on their surcoats wasn't chosen for its gentleness, it was a dare. In the fractious court of 15th century Castile, where noble feuds simmered like pots left too long on the fire, the Order of the Dove made their radical proposition: what if knights sheathed their swords before blood was spilled? Founded in 1423 by a coalition of reformist nobles and a weary King John II, this short-lived brotherhood redefined protection to mean not just defending lands, but defending the very idea of unity. Their emblem, a dove clutching an olive branch in one talon and a sheathed sword in the other, was less a symbol than a battle standard for an entirely different kind of war. What set them apart wasn't their armor, though they wore it, but their ledger books. Each knight carried not just weapons, but meticulously compiled dossiers of inter-noble grievances, debts, and marriage ties. When tensions flared between, say, the Manrique and Mendoza clans, Dove Knights would arrive unbidden, setting up neutral negotiation tents on disputed borderlands. Their rules forbade them from taking sides, but mandated they stay until terms were reached, even if it meant weeks of mediation. One remarkable account from Burgos describes how they resolved a 3-generation feud over sheep grazing rights by orchestrating a joint shearing festival where rival families split profits evenly, turning a flashpoint into a tradition that lasted centuries. Their methods mixed chivalric honor with shrewd psychology, knowing Castilian nobles would rather swallow poison than lose face publicly. they pioneered discreet arbitrations, secret meetings in monasteries where compromises could be framed as mutual victories. Their greatest tool was the truce shield, an actual ceremonial object passed between feuding lords. While holding it, all hostilities ceased. Breaking this pledge meant automatic excommunication and the order's collective wrath. Few risked it. By 1435, their influence had grown so potent that chroniclers noted a curious trend. Rival nobles began preemptively inviting dove knights to witness disputes, knowing their presence alone forced civility. Yet their downfall came from an unexpected quarter: success. As civil wars dwindled, the nobility grew restless without enemies, and whispers spread that the order's peacemaking weakened Castile's martial spirit. When King Henry IV's reign descended into chaos, the Doves found themselves outmatched by a new era of intrigue they couldn't mediate away. Their last act was characteristically quiet, brokering safe passage for deposed ministers during a coup before disbanding in 1469. The order's legacy hides in plain sight. Modern Spanish legal terms like acuerdo de paloma, Dove's Accord, still describe out-of-court settlements, while their truce shield's design inspired today's parliamentary mace. They proved that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with steel, but with the patience to untangle the knots that bind men to their grudges, and that true victory leaves no widows weeping. These 22 orders teach us something profound about the fragile threads that hold civilizations together. While kings and conquerors dominate history books, it was often these small bands of knights, outnumbered, underfunded, yet unwavering, who quietly determined whether a village survived winter, a trade route remained open, or a language outlasted an invasion. Their stories whisper a counter-narrative to the grand sweep of empires. That resilience isn't just about power, but about the choices of ordinary people organized into something extraordinary. Consider the paradox of their legacy. Many of these orders left no magnificent castles or sprawling libraries. Instead, their monuments are the unremarkable things we take for granted. The market towns that still thrive along medieval trade routes, the folk songs preserving languages once on the brink, the irrigation channels still feeding farms 8 centuries later. The true measure of their success isn't in battles won, but in the normalcy they made possible. Children playing safely in fields their grandparents might have fled, merchants haggling over goods instead of bartering for their lives. Yet their greatest lesson might be how they redefine heroism. These weren't flawless paragons of chivalry, but pragmatic problem solvers who adapted to their moment. Some wielded swords, others wielded ledgers, plows, or medical knowledge. They understood that protection isn't just a martial act, it's the meticulous work of maintaining systems, relationships, and trust. When the Order of the Dove mediated feuds or the Tower and Sword Knights studied tidal charts, they proved that guardianship wears many faces. So as we close this chapter, let's ask not just who these forgotten defenders were, but what they represent. In our own uncertain times, their legacy challenges us to notice the modern equivalents: the nurses, engineers, and community organizers who stand between order and chaos. History may not remember most of their names, but it bends under the weight of their collective stubbornness. If these stories resonated with you, share which order's mission spoke to your sense of courage. And don't forget to join us next time as we keep unearthing history's quiet game.